It's really great to see all of you here on a Friday afternoon when it's beautiful out. I kind of have to feel like I have to applaud all of you guys for being here. I think it's awesome. And I want to thank Feryan so much for organizing this and having me here. It's really great. As Paul stated, I work at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. The acronym is ICNC. And ICNC is a private operating foundation in Washington, D.C. And what we do is we look at non-military strategies to fight oppression. In particular, we look at what we call nonviolent conflict, sometimes also called civil resistance. I'll use both terms in my presentation pretty much synonymously. Nonviolent conflict, civil resistance, which is a way of struggling that many, many grassroots human rights movements around the world are using, have used historically, and certainly in this present time it seems to be increasing. We look at questions like, why do grassroots movements for human rights succeed sometimes, and why other times do they fail? What kind of strategies and tactical choices work best for these kinds of movements when they're taking on adversaries that may be armed, that may be very well financed, seemingly well organized, and seem to have all the advantages, and yet sometimes David beats Goliath. Sometimes these grassroots movements triumph. We look at how and why that happens. We try to distill best practices from looking at a wide range of cases, trying to find sort of key cross-cutting elements for why these movements can be successful and effective. And I've been doing this for about 9 years, and this present moment is a really exciting time for me, and I know for my colleagues who have been working at this for quite some time. Since the beginning of 2011, virtually every time I read the news, virtually every single day, I'm seeing a major story, like a fairly prominent major story about what a nonviolent movement is doing somewhere. I mean, that's remarkable. You think about it from Tunisia and Egypt, and now movements that we've seen all over the Middle East, as well as elsewhere. There's been some reports on China, there have been reports on a whole variety of places. It's amazing to see this kind of attention, this kind of, I would say, newfound confidence in nonviolent means, and the demand for knowledge about how these movements work has been increasing quite substantially in accordance with this increased usage. Though I would also say that nonviolent movements have been around for a long time, and really for the last 10 years there's been a great deal of activity, much of it not covered by the traditional media, but now that seems to be starting to change, at least in some cases. So what I want to talk about here is part of meeting the demand for knowledge about this involves really getting into some key elements for how and why these movements work. So, my presentation has 3 parts. First, I want to define what civil resistance, also known as nonviolent action, is. And although my presentation isn't overwhelmingly academic, I'm going to give you an academic definition of this term. I think it's important that we really precisely, clearly state what we're talking about when we talk about nonviolent movements and the kinds of tactics that they use. I'll also talk a little bit about in what circumstances nonviolent action is used, as well as when historically it's been used. The second part, the enduring truths part of my presentation, is going to focus on the dynamics of nonviolent conflict, the principles of waging nonviolent struggle that are as relevant today as they were 100 years ago, and will be relevant 100 years from now as much as they are today. The sort of timeless elements of what nonviolent movements encounter and the kinds of strategies and messages that have been tested many times and worked. And the third section is going to focus on new developments, contemporary circumstances that may not have been present 20 years ago or 20 years from now as much, but are present now nonetheless and are affecting these movements a great deal. So one of which is the spread of knowledge about how people wage nonviolent struggle. And the second one is new technologies, which has clearly gotten a lot of attention in the media and a lot of interest among many different sectors. So we'll talk a bit about what new technologies mean, what they can do, as well as what they can't do. So, what is civil resistance? Has anyone here heard of Gene Sharp? It's been in the news a little bit lately. There's been some articles written about it. Yes, good. Those who know him are big fans sometimes. In 1973, a man by the name of Gene Sharp published a book called The Politics of Nonviolent Action. And I was talking with a friend just yesterday about what an interesting title, The Politics of Nonviolent Action. Nonviolent action is a form of politics. And in that book, which I would say is groundbreaking, and really 40 years ago set up the foundation for a whole way of understanding nonviolent social movements. In that book, Sharp, he used the term nonviolent action, I'll use civil resistance, defined it as such. Nonviolent action, civil resistance, I'm paraphrasing, is a way for ordinary people to wage struggle, oftentimes for rights, freedom, and justice, without the use of violence. It consists of three kinds of actions. One, acts of commission. This is when people do things that they're not supposed to do, that they're not expected to do, or that they are forbidden by law from doing. So, for example, demonstrating is an act of commission. If you all went out and demonstrated, that would certainly be an act of commission. We could do it right now. Displaying of certain symbols, communicating certain messages through song, through the arts, establishing sometimes certain websites that document human rights abuses, rallies. There's a wide variety of acts of commission that can be done. And one of the things that I love about nonviolent movements is that they keep inventing new ways to disobey. It's really, really exciting. You can be very creative. I have 2 young children, and I would argue that it is in all of us, very deeply and very early on established that we know how to disobey creatively. We're actually, our creativity is unlocked when we're told to disobey and we're trying to resist something that we don't like. The second kind of action is an act of omission. It says when people don't do things that they're supposed to do, expected to do, or required by law to do. School boycott, boycott of certain products, British cloth, alcohol, whatever. I mean, those were 2 things that Gandhi advocated for boycotting. In Montgomery, Alabama, it was buses. They boycotted buses in the US Civil Rights Movement. Strikes, and there were a whole bunch of different kinds of strikes. Slowdowns, sick-ins, where everyone calls in sick. It's a whole range. Withdrawal of bank deposits, tax avoidance, tax resistance. There's lots of ways that you could do things that you're not supposed to do. And the third is a combination of both. And this, for example, would be the establishment of an alternative school, for example. Not only am I going to pull my children out and my neighbor's children are going to pull out of the existing school system, but we're going to create an alternative school for them to go to. It's a combination of an act of omission and commission. Now, notice in Sharp's definition, he's not talking about nonviolence as an ethical or moral proposition. This is one major break that Sharp made. He said, we can study this as a social science, looking at what's effective and what's not effective, regardless of people's moral beliefs. So he's looking at this as a way of struggle, not as a moral set of ideas or precepts. Okay. The other thing is it's not conflict resolution per se. It can go along with conflict resolution, but this is really about how people wage struggle. This is about fighting, for lack of a better word sometimes, rather than negotiating, though oftentimes the fight and the negotiation can go on simultaneously. So why do people engage in this? People engage in civil resistance generally when they're facing some sort of oppression that they feel must be overcome, and concurrently when they have some sort of vision that they want to achieve and that they're frustrated from achieving. And the conventional wisdom tells us that when people are facing oppression, when people have grievances, they have different options available to them. And the first option that's often cited is elections. If you've got a problem, you should vote for different people in office. Go through conventional party politics, start your own political party, or file a lawsuit, use the legal system. And to be sure, there are countries and societies in which these means have been very effective at making change. and then there are societies in which these are partially effective, and then there are societies in which these really are not effective. And indeed, they can be effective in one society for one issue, but not necessarily another. For example, minorities in a democracy still may not be able to get up that critical mass of numbers because it's a minority group to be able to vote, to get laws changed. On the other hand, a majority in democracies can redress grievances this way more easily. So the second option is if elections and the legal system seem insufficient, people will try to negotiate. They're often told to negotiate, and indeed negotiations sometimes work. There's a real science and an art to negotiating, which I respect a great deal, but there are circumstances in which negotiations fail. And there are situations as well when negotiated agreements are come to and quickly breached because there's no enforcement mechanism. The third is third-party intervention. If negotiations, elections, lawsuits have failed, maybe some powerful third party will come and help those who are oppressed find leverage, find a way to change a situation. And indeed, sometimes it works, yet we also know that third parties may have their own agendas. They may not come at all. Or they may come, but they may not have the power to actually change things because they're external to the conflict. And at that point, when those three options are exhausted, generally some people give up hope, become passive or apathetic. Other people might decide, okay, well, we need to engage in, quote unquote, the strongest way of trying to fight, which is violence, some sort of insurrectionary movements. My point is that those four options have had millions, if not billions of dollars devoted to their research, millions of pages written about them. And at least I can vouch for the first three that all of them can be quite useful in certain circumstances. But there is another option that's gotten a lot less attention. And that is when other traditional means have failed. When other traditional means have failed, thank you, there is an option to wage nonviolent action. There is an option to wage nonviolent conflict. And my next slide, you'll see I'm going to go over quite a few cases in the last 25 years where this is exactly what people have done. One of the great things about nonviolent conflict is that it's also not geographically or culturally specific. It's been waged by people of all religions on every continent on Earth except for Antarctica, so far as I know, and by people of all ages and all persuasions. So just broadly, and I won't go through every case one by one, but you saw dictators who were supported by the United States, Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines in 1986, Augusto Pinochet in Chile in 1988, dictators who had no compunction about being able to kill their own people in order to maintain their rule, both ousted by and large by nonviolent movements in those respective years up there. Of less attention is the first Palestinian Intifada from 87 to 89, in which Israeli deaths went down dramatically as people in the occupied territories engaged in boycotts, setting up alternative schools, strikes, protests, a wide range of nonviolent sanctions. Then there are the cases that relate to the end of communism, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, all of which engaged in nonviolent forms of struggle against the Soviet Union. Poland from 80 to 89, the other states for more towards the end of their time. And I would note that of the states listed there, at least the Baltics, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, all of those, subsequent to those nonviolent struggles, have embraced democracy very, very rapidly. You also have cases where it didn't work. Ostensibly didn't work. I mean, in Burma in 1988, there were massacres. That movement did not rise again anytime soon thereafter. And of course, in China in 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacres. So by no means am I being triumphalist and saying, my gosh, this will work all the time everywhere. What I'm saying is that it really needs further research and further study and further attention to figure out where and why and how it can work when it can. I'd also point out that in Russia in 1991, this was when there was increasing political and economic liberalization in that state. There was a hardline coup designed to take the Soviet Union back, to reverse a lot of the political change that had taken place. That was defeated nonviolently, that coup. South Africa, starting from the early 1980s, that moved from a predominantly armed struggle to a predominantly unarmed struggle as nonviolent methods continued to prove more effective, though this is a topic of debate, so I'm sure there would be people who could disagree, and I would argue that nonviolent tactics became more effective in South Africa and hence were adopted more. Going down, you have what came to be called the Color Revolution. Serbia in 2000, the overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic, the dictator of 13 years who launched several wars, a convicted war criminal. The former Soviet Republic of Georgia, Ukraine. So what we're seeing here, look at this. 2000, 2002, 2003, 2004, in Lebanon in 2005 against occupation by Syrian troops, Nepal in 2006 against their monarch, then Burma again rose unsuccessfully in 2007, but there's really increasing incidents, particularly in the last decade. It's remarkable. And we go here and you see all these sort of ongoing cases that I've listed there, and that's just a few of them. I mean, we could look globally and find many, many more. And these are just the national struggles. I could find struggles against corporations. I could find subnational struggles. I could find local struggles, regional struggles. There is a lot of activity here. And still much of it is going underneath the radar screen of the media and to some extent the academy, but it is getting more mention these days, which is good. So enduring truths. What makes these movements effective? How on earth do nonviolent movements triumph against well-armed or well-financed opponents? How does that happen? Well, one way to get at this question, and I'm going to go back to Gene Sharp here, is to look at power and to ask the question, where does power come from? And Sharp early on in his work, talked about two different theories of power. And the first one he referred to as the monolithic theory of power. So imagine you have a big triangle, okay? Well, tall, long, thin triangle. And here's your rulers at the top. And at the bottom are all those who are ruled, who seem to have no political power. And the ruler makes rules, and those at the bottom basically have to go along with it. They can't really exert upwards. The decrees come from the top and go to the bottom. If the decrees aren't enough, the government can buy people off with money, and they can certainly repress people and scare them. And if we accept, and this is the model of power that is implicit. No one ever told me that this is what power is, but it was implicit in so much of what we see in history, by the telling of history, by the way in which news is reported, by the way in which we're taught in the academy. This is the default assumption. Power is often, when they talk about using force, as if, what's force? Force is frequently referred to as, frequently refers to violence, as if that is the strongest force. And if you accept this monolithic theory of power, then the best that these people on the bottom can do is hope to knock this person off the top and maybe install their own person. And hopefully that person will be in a better mood and be nicer and do something different. But at the end of the day, that structure is fixed. And what Sharp said is that that theory is actually false. That theory is not how power actually works. So I'm going to put two quotes here. The first one is by the political philosopher Hannah Arendt. And Arendt is talking about what happens in a situation of oppression when fear starts to fall away, when those who are oppressed lose their fear and start acting strategically in an organized way. I'll read it because not all of you can, perhaps in the back. When this happens, the situation changes abruptly. Not only is the rebellion not put down, but the arms themselves sometimes change hands, sometimes even within a few hours. The sudden dramatic breakdown of power that ushers in revolution reveals in a flash how civil obedience to laws, to rulers, to institutions is but the outward manifestation of support and consent. So what's Arendt saying here? Suddenly this power structure that seems so real can shift within minutes or hours, during revolutions anyway, when people withdraw this consent. The outward manifestation of support and consent, when that's withdrawn, obedience is withdrawn. And when obedience is withdrawn, these systems start to crumble very quickly sometimes. Gandhi said it in one sentence: "For even the most powerful cannot rule without consent of the ruled." So, this leads us to what Sharp referred to as the second theory of power, the pluralistic theory of power. This sees power as a transaction. Ultimately, the ruler can give decrees, the CEO can, can make policies, but ultimately those policies have to be carried out. And we well know what tools, persuasion, economic reward, if that doesn't work, sanctions, getting fired from your job, for example, or imprisonment or other things, a ruler can try to do to compel obedience. But those tools don't necessarily always compel obedience, and this is where it starts to get really interesting. What we saw in Egypt, we saw those tools used, and they didn't work. They were not sufficient. We've seen these used in many, many other conflicts, some of which I listed there, and they weren't sufficient. And if you accept this pluralistic theory of power, that power is based on consent, and I mean, we can illustrate it right now. If each of you started tapping on the table, I couldn't talk. I need all of your consent to be here. Thank you very much. But you could take it away like that, and I'd just be some guy sitting here talking. So, power is fragile. And this is the good news for grassroots nonviolent movements, because this means that they can, if they're giving the system power with their actions, with their day-to-day behaviors, microtransactions, just the mundane things, the products that they buy, the amount of TV they watch, the kinds of institutions that they go to, the ways in which they talk at school or at functions, going to their job, paying their taxes, doing their job, all of these small interactions. If that's what holds things up, then when people shift their behavior, again, acts of omission, acts of commission, the balance of power in society can really start to shift. It can really start to shift. People can direct it. The challenge, of course, is how do they all act together? How do they act systematically, strategically, collectively together to do this? Now, my colleague, Peter Ackerman, who has been in this field now for over 30 years and wrote his dissertation looking at different strategic principles and other factors that contributed to the success or failure of different nonviolent movements, came up with a significant list of many, many different factors, and he later had to squash that list down into 12 factors when he published a book. But when he gave lectures, 12 principles was too many. So he distilled it down to 3. 3 really core key principles that contribute to nonviolent movement success. So it's interesting when you hear in the media these days speculation about where's the next revolution going to happen, where could it happen, where might it happen, or oh, are the people in this country going to be successful? A quick question for you to ask yourself is, I wonder if this movement has unity, I wonder if it has strategic planning, and I wonder if it has nonviolent discipline. And I realize I should do a time check right now before going forward. Okay, I'll take another 10, 15 minutes. I've been told this is okay. So, unity. One thing that movements do is they're able to unify people on a vision of what they want. And frequently it's not just, I'm going to give you, in this system you're going to have this, 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 and here are the new policies we're going to have. It's often as well on an issue of values. So here's one of the great unifying statements, in the history of civil resistance, drawn from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. King also, you'll note, anyone who's followed the movement knows, he was a minister, and his use of Christian imagery, symbols, values as well was woven into that movement. So he was calling on people as Americans, those who believed in or were devout in their Christianity as well. He was calling to them. He was calling to them for justice. He was speaking at the level of values. And this is frequently, if you look at another statement, this is a long one, I'll just read a few parts. This was put out in Egypt by a coalition of youth movements during the revolution. Fellow great Egyptian citizens, we are your daughters, your brothers and sisters, ... The matter goes beyond figures in particular to the whole administration of the Egyptian state, which was transformed from a servant of the people to a master of them. And I'll go ahead a little bit. The dignity of life and security of the Egyptian people is far more valuable than any single person's dignity, no matter how high a position he holds. They're speaking in a language of values here. They're saying, who are the Egyptians here? We're the Egyptians. It doesn't matter who this one person is in this government building. We are a family. They're using the imagery of family right in the beginning. And it's this kind of language, not only this kind of language, but one of the characteristics of movements that have been able to unify people is that they can frequently find values shared by many people and bring people together on those values. They also, movements build diverse participation. In 2005, there was a movement in Egypt called Kifaya, which means enough in Arabic. And without going into too much detail, one of the issues that Kifaya had is that they took a stance on an issue, I believe it was the wearing of the veil, that certain Islamist groups disagreed with. And this really hurt their base of support potentially because suddenly they had picked an issue that really divided. Whereas if you look at the recent Egyptian revolution, what was being chanted? Muslim, Christian, we are all Egyptian. There was, we are going to make sure that in our choice of issues and language, we are appealing to as broad a base as we can. And student movements that want to achieve things that relate directly to students, sure, they may be sufficient to get that by themselves. But if they want to achieve something societal change, they better find a way to get labor in there. They better find a way to get many, many other constituencies in there and be able to talk larger than themselves, which requires, among other things, listening. And one thing that people don't know frequently is the amount of listening, for example, that Gandhi did before he even launched the Salt March. How many people here know about the Salt March? For those of you who don't, there's a great film called A Force More Powerful that outlines it as well. You could watch the film Gandhi. One of the most brilliant nonviolent tactics in history. I'm just going to push ahead. They also plan. Movements that are successful frequently plan. I've got here Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, which I believe was finished in 600 BC. Know yourself, know your opponent, you will know the outcome of 100 battles. It's paraphrased, but that's... And what Sun Tzu is saying is that you can't develop a strategy unless you have a basis of facts and informed assumptions. You've got to figure out where you're strong, where the adversary is weak, how to concentrate strengths against weaknesses. You've got to figure out where to push. Movements don't have infinite strength. They have to figure out what the next step is. This is based on analysis. And I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to keep going. One quick thing is that if you look, here's sort of a graphic depiction. At the top of this triangle is a movement's vision. Once they figured out their vision that unifies people, they develop campaigns, major aspects of their movement for change, and then tactics, specific actions to further those campaigns, to further their vision. And when a movement is working really well, you see all those arrows reinforcing each other into the vision. They're all headed in the same direction. Tactics reinforce campaigns, which reinforce vision. So for example, if you look at the US Civil Rights Movement, the vision, voting rights and desegregation, campaigns, Nashville lunch counter sit-ins is one, Montgomery bus boycotts is another, the Freedom Rides is another, tactics, boycotts, strikes, demonstrations, etc., etc. And just as a contrast, here's my image of a movement that's not coordinated. They got lots of good ideas and they just can't figure out which direction to go. So everyone's kind of doing their own thing, and there's no momentum. And coming back to Sun Tzu, here's what Sun Tzu had to say about that. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And finally, nonviolent movements that are successful remain nonviolent. This goes without saying, but I'll say it briefly. Nonviolence increases participation among people. Lots of people will not participate in a violent movement. Lots of people will in a nonviolent one. It also makes it much more difficult for an adversary to repress a movement. There are a whole host of other reasons, but I won't go into those right now. New developments. One new development that's not being looked at by the media as much is the spread of knowledge. I would contend that the ability to wage nonviolent struggle is a skill. It's a skill-based enterprise. I mean, to draw a crass analogy, it's almost like, a game of soccer is skill. It's not a game, waging nonviolent struggle, but it's the same kind of struggle. Movements get better at it over time. So as information spreads about this, people are getting better. And I will say that the amount of resources for people, the amount of communication going on among activists around the world seems to be increasing quite a bit. The other thing is that confidence matters. part of what made Tunisia so remarkable is that it gave Egyptians confidence that they could do what they could do. And when Egyptians did, it gave Libyans confidence that they could do it. Now, Libya didn't go on that same path for too long. It went in a different direction, but Syrians as well, Yemenis, people in Bahrain. I have to skip this, I don't have time. This, oh, did I hear them? Okay. This is a pamphlet that people can get. It's called How to Protest Intelligently. It was put out by Egyptian demonstrators. There were 20,000 of them printed, passed out. This is just one little example of information dissemination. They had examples of signs that people could hold, talking about how the police and the people were together. And here people are clearly learning about how to deal with the police. One way to deal with the police, embracing them. Okay? They mapped out routes for people so that they could reach a critical mass quickly and then be able to go to Tahrir Square. They even used Google Maps. Skip that. They had, here's what you should wear. Now this is all very tactical. There's a lot of knowledge that can be spread around that's broader and more strategic and based on sort of big ideas, but I don't have time to show examples of that. So this is just a little example in Egypt of like what they did to spread some of this information. Here's where you need to put your spray paint on the cameras and on the windshields of the vehicles that are trying to oppress you. Here's how to publish this information. Don't post it online, just use a photocopier. Here's another, this is the Fellowship of Reconciliation put this out. This is about the civil rights movement. It was found by an Egyptian blogger, I believe Dalia Ziada, and it got it translated into Arabic and spread it around. Information spreading. Now, new technologies, and I'm sorry I'm rushing, I've really only got 2 minutes left. This is a big topic of debate. I can't come up here and tell you new technologies are great, they're really going to unlock everything, and I can't tell you they're really overrated, they're not going to do anything. And there are people on both sides who will tell you either of those things. I mean, not 100%, but there's a lot of disagreement about this issue, and the sides are pretty clearly defined. On the pros, people say, well, new technologies give us publicity, allow us to collaborate, give us alternative political space to talk, develop rhetoric and discourse, give us global reach, give us anonymity so we can do things. Here's an anonymous Egyptian activist. We use Facebook to schedule protests, Twitter to coordinate, and YouTube to tell the world. And to be sure, if before digital technology there were certain countries in which a regime had control of 100% of the information all the time, anything less than 100% control of that information represents a loss for them. And I think it's very difficult now to find a society in which regimes control information 100% of the time. On the other hand, the cons, misinformation can be spread. Lots of people can try to stir up violence, extremist rhetoric, divisions, security risks. I mean, Facebook, people get arrested, are forced to give away their password, then all their friends are arrested. This is nasty stuff. There's a digital divide. There's still a lot of people who aren't online. What's available for them? How clearly, if just being online was sufficient, but it's not. Because there's plenty of people who aren't, even those who aren't necessarily checking into Facebook on these political blogs all the time. Information overload is a real issue too. Analysis paralysis, just too much. Information is not always knowledge. So here's a recent quote from an Egyptian activist. The counter-revolution, the revolution trying to undo what just happened, has also started using Facebook as well in order to face our revolution and spread false information. Facebook right now is bringing us to a big paralyzed state, a massive flow of information that in some ways holds us still, keeps us focused on just trying to keep up with things more than actually taking part and moving forward. We're also an isolated community from other communities in Facebook, such as, basically each community is sort of self-segregating and not creating a broader dialogue. Here's one other point. What's this? This is the amount of digital traffic on January 27th out of Egypt. And that's January 28th. If a movement depends only on digital technology to organize itself, just look at January 28th. That could be taken away. Now some people will say, well, you can use satellite phones and other things and dial-up access. That's true, but still the picture is pretty stark. So, conclusion in 1 minute. There is a co-evolution going on right now about new technologies. Those who are oppressing are trying to find ways to use them to oppress. Those who are attempting to fight oppression are using them the other way. It's a coevolution where each side is trying to get ahead of the other and they leapfrog each other. I think this proves that the digital realm, at least in some cases when the internet can be shut down, is not a substitute for, but rather an extension of offline organizing. It doesn't matter how good your online platform is, if you don't have a message that moves people, it's going to be difficult to move people. If you don't have structures on the ground that can mobilize people, or a movement doesn't, the internet shut off, what does it do? So building this, what I call functional redundancy, is really important as well. The rest is still open to debate about the impact of this technology, and I think will be for the foreseeable future. One note on that is that there is some quantitative research that's starting to be done. So instead of just stories about what various technologies did, real cross-cutting, large number research about what technologies have done across a lot of cases, and it will be interesting to see what that reveals. Thank you very much.
After the bulk of the Egyptian uprising, what would you say was the cause of the lack of respect for women? I mean, I read in the newspapers straight from the Egyptians' mouth that the whole respect for women being equal to them during the uprising, it really died out during the bulk of it. You were talking about unity.
Right.
Unity.
Right.
What do you think was the problem there? Why did that die out so quickly?
Well, how exactly did it? I need a little more information before I can answer your question. My understanding, based on those whom I've spoken with, is that women were a really major part of that revolution. And part of why we didn't see it as much in the media was because the media wanted to gravitate towards scenes of rock throwing, and scenes that they sort of, real contention where women generally weren't throwing as many rocks. But again, this is based on the people I've spoken with. Women weren't just in that revolution, they were leading some of that revolution.
Absolutely. One of the articles I read was saying how, I don't remember the exact date, but the women were, asking for equal rights, and they were having their own form of, protest or demonstration, rally, whatever you want to call it. And there were Egyptian men who were part of that whole uprising as well that were, telling them, you have no place here. You shouldn't get equal rights. This was the article I read too. Mm-hmm. I don't remember where it was from though.
Yeah,
It was on International Women's Day.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't read the article, so it's kind of hard for me to comment on it. I mean, what you're saying is plausible, of course. I mean, just because a movement stands for change doesn't mean everyone agrees on what the role of women should be. It's also possible, not separate from that category, but it's quite possible that there are, regimes also really try to plant people to say things that are really unpopular and look really bad on international news, as well as divide a movement. I wouldn't leave that outside the realm of possibility, but I just don't know.
Any other questions?
Really? No one disagrees with me? Wow.
I'm sure my students, they have questions there.
I made a comment here. You were demonstrating the monolithic power, not structure, pyramid, which reminded me, some years ago, David Icke was talking about similar pyramid. And his point was that even though the one that's sitting on the top, and we are at the very bottom, sitting in our little corners, but we are the foundation of this pyramid. And as long as we're standing still, the top has nothing to worry about. But when we become to shake this pyramid, it's going to crumble. So thanks for reminding me. I forgot about this pyramid thing.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hello, how do you get people to, like, you know, like you said, a massive amount of people, you have to have unity. How do you get so many diverse people to get together for like one cause? Because I know, like, it was really interesting what you were saying, but it's hard, especially as like college students.
Yeah.
There's so many aspects, like everybody's different. It's not just 20-year-olds here, it's older people too. How do you get everyone together at one time to really communicate and really unify and make sure, because everybody's schedule is different, that's what I'm saying. How do you really get people together? Because everybody has different things going on.
Thank you, great question. I don't necessarily mean together in one physical space, of course. Like, you know, I mean, we see in Egypt, you know, there was a lot of, you know, demonstrations which made great optics for the media, but there was a lot of really decentralized organizing that went on before that. I have a friend who made a great point, which I like to repeat to people, because it's sort of a challenging point. Is getting 100,000 signatures on a petition online the same as knocking on 100 doors, shaking 100 or 100,000 hands, and actually having people sign it right there in front of you? Is getting 100,000 followers on Facebook the same as knocking on 100,000 doors? And I think, I would argue no, it's really not. It's really not. And part of why it's not is because when you shake those 100,000 hands, you have to listen to people. You have to listen to what's going on for them. And I would point out, you know, a great many people who participate in Egypt, but in other struggles too, were considered, you know, by political scientists to be apathetic or politically disengaged or disinterested. Participation in Egyptian elections was remarkably low. People had given up faith in the system. I mean, I believe the parliamentary election, the government said 30% of people voted. This was, I believe, in November of 2010. Alternative estimates said 8 to 10% of people voted. So here you've got all these people apathetic, right? But a movement that is able to listen to them and speak to them in words that they themselves would use to describe their own circumstances, to talk about what they think about, can sometimes shift the perspective to, in the sort of cliche, make the personal political. Suddenly I'm worried about things that seem personal to me, like how I'm going to pay, you know, for X, Y, and Z. But if that is framed for me in the right way several times, suddenly I realize it's a problem faced by many, many people, and suddenly I get this sense of political consciousness that I could be part of something with these people. So that's sort of one way. Another way is to achieve a small measure of initial victory. If someone achieves a small measure of initial victory on some issue, people take notice. And I'll give you, I keep drawing from the civil rights movement, but the Montgomery bus boycott, they won that. They desegregated buses in Montgomery. Now you could say, well, okay, that's just one small institution in the larger South that needed to be desegregated. But the psychological impact of winning that victory was huge. When people start winning, people start gathering. So winning is a big part of it too.
I heard on the on the Pacific local station, Ian Masters show, and Gene Sharp, is that how you say his name? Gene Sharp. Yeah. And the book, apparently you're a big part of bringing that book out. Said that the Arab world, that's been like a Bible to them in the nonviolent, this whole success of recent events. And it's a sleeper in the Western world. That's what he was saying. I was wondering.
This is what Gene said?
This is what Ian Masters.
Oh, Ian Masters said.
He had interviewed him.
Yeah.
And I mean, he was bringing it up. And he's a very intelligent.
Yeah, I mean, Gene would never refer to his book as a Bible. nor, by the way, would Gene, and I would agree with this, overstate his significance. And I've seen in media coverage of Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere, many other places actually, the media likes to, I mean, they're storytellers, and storytellers need characters. And it's tough to write a story just about ideas. You need characters that personify the ideas. So Gene is a great character to write about. And he is a great intellect, and he's done a lot in this field. But I feel like sometimes the way in which the media will cover Jean or other groups that yes, did something in Egypt or wrote something that was translated, or it sometimes gets overstated by the media. So, I mean, did Jean's ideas and maybe books have some impact? Probably, but I don't know what it is, and I don't even know how much it was. An alternative reading of the situation is that Egyptians and Tunisians were engaged in quite a dialogue over a few years online to figure out a lot of this stuff, as well as the fact that Egyptians, and I can't say as much about Tunisia because I don't know about it as much, Egyptians have really been organizing for 5-6 years. And the biggest learning is the learning you do from yourself, from your own experience, from your own reflection. So they had 2 ostensibly failed campaigns in 2005, 2006, as well as in 2008, that didn't achieve those campaign stated objectives. But what those campaigns did were amazing learning experiences, as well as opportunities for them to start changing the conditions on the ground in Egypt so that they could later win. So in response, I guess I would have to say it was sharp. They probably mattered somewhat, and I just don't know. At the end of the day, these revolutions belong to the people who engaged in them, who made the decisions, who took the risks, and who did the strategizing that no one else could, because no one else external to the situation knows the situation as well.
In Libya, I have neighbors, right here.
Yeah.
I have blue-collar neighbors, and we're constantly talking about the conflicts that are going on. And in Libya, they're very supportive of Obama and the bombings that are going on, saying that they prevented children from becoming orphans. And I try and explain that bombs are not a long-term solution, and they say that answer is not good enough. Give me a better answer for them.
A better answer for them what? About why the West shouldn't be
Why
bombing Libya right now?
isn't the right answer, why?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, if you have a car and it's headed towards a cliff, and it's headed 50 and 60 and 70 miles an hour, and it's at the edge of the cliff, there's very little you can do sometimes to turn it around. And so the question, and it's the same thing when people ask me a question about Rwanda, I don't know. But I do know that we can look back and maybe find some points at which different decisions could have been made that would have changed the situation quite significantly. In the case of Libya, based on my reading of that situation, as we know, Gaddafi's security forces were defecting. When the resistance was nonviolent, the security forces were defecting. They were flying to Malta, they were going to join the opposition. And Gaddafi was also bringing in these mercenaries. And based on, again, my reading, bringing in the mercenaries was leading to a lot of defections among the security forces. It's very unpopular with any kind of army to say, we're going to bring in people from another country now to do this work. So you sort of have to ask the question, well, if the opposition hadn't started shooting, if they hadn't started shooting at the mercenaries as well as the Libyan army, would the Libyan army have continued to defect to the extent that the regime might have collapsed? It might have never gotten to the point where it was at the gates of Benghazi, because it never would have made it there, because the defections from the army just would have decimated it. But we don't know. We don't know. So that's just, it's one different way to think about it. Yeah.
All right. The U.S. has criticized various regimes in the Middle East for committing different human rights abuses and violations, such as Iran, Syria, and lately Egypt. But in Saudi Arabia, there's also a lot of horrible human rights violations going on there. The Saudi Arabian government tolerates very little dissent, and women are treated very, very unequally over there. And yet there's this strong silence prevalent among many Western countries. And I'm just wondering why that is. I mean, the situation in Saudi Arabia is remarkably obscure.
The reason why certain countries would be silent about Saudi Arabia would probably have to do with their geopolitical interests. I mean, as the saying goes, countries have interests, not friends. And so depending on the country and depending on how much they depend on Saudi Arabia, human rights is a sliding scale for a lot of countries. How much they care about it in one place doesn't mean they're going to be consistent in the next place. As to why the US government's doing that, I mean, yeah. I don't work for the government or the foreign policy establishment, so I just don't know. But I mean, I can guess. In my role here, though, I try not to be too political, but yeah. How are we doing for time? I really don't want to go too far.
Yeah.
Okay. Someone else can call in questions.
Oh.
I had the opportunity to meet and talk with Bernard Lafayette, who was involved with the lunch counter sit-ins, and asked him, you know, what was it that made him able to stand up to the violence that was directed toward him, because, you know, he was beaten up more than once. And in your experience, what is that mindset shift that allows people to know that they're going to take it and to stand up to it and not return it?
Well, first of all, I don't have experience with that, so I have to qualify. I'm up here talking to you about this because I've read a lot of books and talked to a lot of activists, but I have not done this. But based on what I have heard and do talk to people about, look, some people get uncomfortable when you make an analogy between nonviolent struggle and armed struggle. But there are certain cross-cutting principles that apply. Otherwise, I wouldn't bring Sun Tzu into the conversation, who originally was a general writing about armed struggle. Nonviolent struggle requires fierce discipline, at least among some people. Training, discipline, getting ready, preparation. You know, one movement is not mentioned as much in history, but you know, we hear a lot about Gandhi and the struggle in British India, but there was Badshah Khan, who is in what is now Pakistan and parts of Afghanistan. At that point, it was called British Northwest Frontier Province. He trained a nonviolent army, like drills, oaths to be nonviolent, uniforms. And I'm not, I mean, that's getting a little far away from your question in terms of Bernard, who, by the way, I greatly respect and admire. But if you look at the footage of James Lawson doing training in the churches in Nashville, he was really trying to prepare people for just this kind of thing, psychologically getting them ready. There are a few other factors, though. Amazing power of a group dynamic. If you're risking it all, and we've all bonded together, I'm going to risk it too. I'm not going to leave you there, and you're not going to leave me there. So there's a power in groups. And the last thing is that a lot of times when people think about nonviolent movements, they think about these iconic moments in which people are face to face with what might happen to them. But a lot of movements happen far away from that. If a movement is not able to have a Bernard Lafayette or have a Jim Lawson or have these people who will train and go out there and get hit, or John Lewis, for example, or Gandhi, they will just pick engagements in which repression is not easy for the opponent. For example, in South Africa in 1984, the Port Elizabeth boycotts. The anti-apartheid movement said, we're not going to shop at any white establishment. Now, how does the security forces suppress people who are choosing not to shop? How can they even identify them? So one way of dealing with violence, which I hear is sort of part of the core of your question, is to not make it easy for them to be violent against you by picking dispersed tactics that are more anonymous and more difficult for them to try to figure out what to do. So, them being the adversary.
Hello. This is a simple question. Einstein said that it's not possible to prepare for peace and engage in war simultaneously. And I have found that true on a personal level. I was wondering if you have any comments about his remark.
It's possible to prepare for peace and war simultaneously.
To prepare for peace and engage in war simultaneously is impossible.
I don't know. I don't know. It's a good question, though. I'm not dismissing the question. I'm just saying I don't have an answer at this moment. But a question we should all ask ourselves.
Run, Chip, run!
Yeah.
Chip got his exercise today.
In watching that film, A Force More Powerful.
Yeah.
We watched that in one of my classes, and one of the things they talked about was the sticks. You know, God, you prepare people to be beat, you know, with sticks. How do you view from a point of civil resistance the concept of sabotage, in the way that what occurred to me when I saw the film A Force More Powerful, and the thing with the sticks, now they would use crowd control, beat people with sticks. I said, well, if it were me, why not secretly gather up all these sticks, put them in a pile, and light it on fire?
Yes, I get the question. Property destruction question.
And thus, you know, don't do it violently where everybody can see you, and certainly don't call in false tips on yourself. But how do y'all feel about the message of sabotage?
Yeah. How do I, you know, I get asked that question a lot actually. How do I feel about sabotage? It's true. I'm going to put the question back to you guys. And I'm going to challenge you not to think of it from a moral or ethical standpoint. I'm not going to try to define exactly what violence is and exactly what's nonviolent, because we always know there's an area where you could talk about structural violence and property destruction and, you know, where does your concept of violence and nonviolent action ends. I want to talk about what's strategically effective, or ask you what's strategically effective. Now, I was talking with someone who, shoot, I forget the organization, but they went, hopped a fence in a military base, hit a bunch of airplanes, or was it missiles, I forget, and then they sat down and waited to be arrested. That's one kind of property destruction. And they said, well, that's okay because we're sitting here, standing up for it, we're not running. I heard another case of environmental advocates lighting a bunch of Hummers on fire and running away. Then there's the case of Vietnam and the draft card. Then there's the case of destruction of, you know, police, you know, whatever, or you can, there's lots of different property that's been destroyed in the past. I think the question is what works? And when property starts being destroyed, generally speaking, though it depends on the circumstance, you could say, well, in this case, maybe it won't strategically backfire. But generally speaking, one, it gives a justifiable response to arrest people or to repress them. Two, it tends to lead to a depiction of the movement as unruly, untrustworthy, not committed to rule of law. If they're destroying this property today, they might destroy yours tomorrow, kind of thing. So it's important just to think about those kinds of strategic questions. You're never going to destroy all the billy clubs that the police have. They're always going to have more. So if your goal is to disarm them, it's not going to work. So then the question is, well, what's the impact that that kind of an act would have on third parties who you want to support you? Yes?
Okay, I wanted to give you an example. Your first question. Most people don't talk about this. It was May 4th, 1970. Over half the people in the room weren't even born. I happened to be in high school then, and these kids, I went to high school in Ohio. These kids from Kent State University came up on our campus, campuses all across the region. We went to Kent State, they helped us with the homework, they fed us after school, and in about spring, they started talking to us about the Vietnam War and how we, as high school juniors and seniors, were 1 to 2 years away from being drafted and going to war. And then they laid the game plan. At that time, we didn't know that this was going on at high schools and colleges all across the United States. And on May 4th, 1970, at 11:30 a.m., we walked out of our high school. We had a 6-lane street. They were building the new high school across the street. We got the sawhorses, put them down across the road, sat down, and the most powerful thing in the world to us at that time happened. 18-wheelers had to do U-turns because they couldn't run over us. Now, of course, James A. Rhodes told the National Guard to shoot, and 4 kids were killed in Ohio. But that was a very powerful I thought, very powerful nonviolent movement. It came 5 years before the war ended, but it was a statement that people, you guys' age, because we were high school students and they were college students, and it went from NYU to Berkeley on that very day, all across the United States. And all we did was go outside and sit down.
Power.
That was power.
That was power. Thank you for that. Thank you. Yeah. One thing what you just said says to me, and it's something I think that all of us need to be reminded of, is that all of us are a lot more powerful than we think we are. And you never know the limits of your own power, and particularly the power of a group you may be part of until you test it, until you push it. So the assumption is I'm powerless, I can do nothing. And indeed, sometimes just one person can do very little. But particularly when that person unites with a group, and particularly when they're young, very difficult to arrest lots of young people. They can have a lot more power than they think. So thank you.
Hardy, one of the things that a good resource, and I think something that I'm sure you would have said, is just looking at Gene Sharp's 198 list.
Yes.
And the things that we do every day that really constitute nonviolence, or nonviolent strategic action, the things that we can do, voting, writing a letter to the newspaper, the things that we in this society often scoff at as being ineffective, that in many parts of the world that will land you in jail quicker than you can, whatever. That the failure to use some of these systems actually then creates often the spaces filled with autocratic rulers and the things that we don't like in our society. I mean, Americans often think, well, I can't write a letter to the newspaper, nobody cares, or I can't vote. Well, if you don't do it, then a minority runs the country and you're marginalized. That I include this audience here, encouraging people here to think about the things that we take for granted that Gene would say, these are as powerful as anything that you could be using.
Yeah, thank you.
So that list has always been very important to me.
Thank you. You didn't mean to, but you've also given me a perfect setup line now where I can talk about websites where people can find more information. David just mentioned Gene Sharp's list of 198 methods. When Gene Sharp wrote The Politics of Nonviolent Action, he identified 198 different tactics, different methods, ways in which nonviolent action has been used, and documented every single one of them in history. Now, I have not yet seen someone formally expand on that list, but I know it can be expanded. And I mean, particularly with digital technologies now, there are many, many other methods. But even 198, if we just stop there, it goes to show you the range of things that can be done. Not all of them high risk, not all of them requiring you quit your job, not all of them requiring you take a vow of poverty. But even small things that can be done that when lots of people do them are remarkably effective. So that list can be found on the website of the Albert Einstein Institution, which is the organization that Gene works at. It can be found on ICMC's website, nonviolent-conflict.org, and it can actually be found lots of other places around the web. In addition, films have been published, have been created. A Force More Powerful was mentioned by one questioner earlier. Bringing Down a Dictator, documenting how the movement ousted Milosevic in Serbia, Orange Revolution about the Ukrainian Revolution, and numerous other resources exist. So, if you're interested, I don't have enough business cards for all of you, you can go to ICNC's website, you can email them, ask for me, and I would be happy to connect you people with more resources or direct you to, wherever your interest may be, whether it's an academic interest, whether you're an organizer, whether you're a journalist, NGO, whatever. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.